Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Continuing with Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, I'd like to talk a little about my wife and myself, in as far as she was working as a lecturer in King Faisal University, and after a while, for about 5 years, and then I suggested to her that she stop working. She did do some teaching, but I really wanted her to stop working, and then she could concentrate on not just our family life, but on her own life in terms of the circles that she was getting involved in, and also we could do a bit more charitable work perhaps. And actually she agreed, and I think she was happy to stop working, and she built up these circles into girls and women. And also I said to her that I'd like to build up a library so that we had reference books, and that one of the big benefits in Saudi Arabia is that the books in Arabic are reasonably priced. If you want to buy them in the UK, for instance, you have to pay quite a lot of money for them, or the same type of book. So we actually started to build up a library of not just Arabic but Urdu and English books as well. And this was a big benefit for background reading and looking up reference works and so on and so forth when you're talking on Islam, because you don't know it all and you have to find it out from somewhere, and the internet wasn't available in those days, okay? And where could you go to get it? If I wanted to go to the King Faisal Library in general, for instance, you might find some books in English, but it was difficult for me to handle the index system and so on and so forth. In the university they had a library, and only about 20% was Arabic, the rest were English, but not on the books that I was really interested in necessarily. So again, it was a bit of a problem as to where to get the information from. So the best thing to do was to actually start a library. And we're better than Saudi, where you could get the Arabic books as well. And even if you got the English translation, at least you had the Arabic to refer back to. And since my wife knew Arabic, she could do these things as well. And this is actually what happened. And then when we had children come over, if they wanted to read, there were books there that they could read as well, which was also a benefit. And she could spend more time in the house, and she could look after cooking and things like this. So alhamdulillah, things were going quite well, and she was happy. She really didn't want to work, I think, at that time, and I can understand that. And social life on campus can be reasonably good. We had quite good circles because she was knowing Arabic and Urdu. She was friendly with the Arabic group and also friendly with the Urdu group, and in my case I was friendly with the Urdu group in general, not so much with the British group, okay, but also with the Arabic group to a certain extent. So in that sense we had a good time. I was also playing squash quite a lot. I was playing squash almost every day while we were in Dhahran, and in Riyadh I was playing twice a week or 3 times a week, so it kept me active, and it got things out of my system too, alhamdulillah. And there has to be a balance, I think, between either studying and play or work and play. You have to have a balance somehow if you can find it, and I tried to find it by playing squash. And that was another good thing. And as I said, we had these relaxing drives out into the desert, and in general we would also worrying about the families from time to time, because the brother-in-law, the husband of a sister in Glasgow, he died around about 1980, and there were 3 kids and a mother, so we tried to help them in whatever way we could. And then another sister's husband died in Pakistan, and we tried to help them as best we could. And so it went on. We would try to do what we could in terms of helping others, and that was fine. And at one time I wanted to buy a house, and the house next door to my eldest brother, the guy wrote to me and said, "You were looking for a house opposite once," he said, "and we want to sell our house. Would you be interested in buying it?" So I said, of course, because the eldest brother would look after it while we were abroad, and it was an ideal location. So I thought this was going to go quite smoothly, and I went ahead, and we actually sent some money for the deposit, and actually I ended up buying the house, okay, but only for a week. what happened was that the guy was the local magistrate, and we were using the same solicitor, and he wanted to use the deposit and put it down for buying another house, and you can't do that. Okay, so the solicitors withdrew. I had to find another solicitor. Then I had to talk to the guy, and he wanted me to buy the other house that he wanted to buy and keep the house that he had. Well, by this time I'd had enough, because there was no point buying another house so far away when I wanted the one next door to my brother. So we withdrew, and then I wanted to clear the thing up, and it became a bit of a mess, and the lawyers were hanging back. But I actually went to the site which he was going to buy this new house on, and talked to the site engineer, and he'd been out in Dubai, and he was friendly because I was out in Saudi Arabia. He knew the situation, and he gave me all the details. The crux of the matter was that I was supposed to have a deadline of 1 week after the guy put the deposit down on the house that he was going to buy. And the solicitors were saying they didn't know any dates, they hadn't got any information. And yet this guy gave me all the information I needed. Okay, not only amount, but account number and the date and so on. Okay, so I went back to the solicitor and I said, I've got this information, how come you haven't got it? How come his solicitor hasn't told you? And I came to the conclusion that this was a thing going on between the solicitors and the magistrate, because they would have been in his court. I could be wrong, but that's the conclusion I came to. Anyway, it was all resolved. I told them I wanted it sorted out, and I was leaving the next day. It had to be done that day. And they came back and said he's agreed. So everything done. And now that house fell through, and because he was a magistrate, I thought that Allah didn't want me to buy a house. Okay, because it's such an unusual case. You wouldn't expect the guy to be a magistrate who should know something about the law, go through the whole procedure, and then turn around and want to withdraw. And his excuse was that his wife didn't want to leave the house she'd gone attached to it. And my attitude was, I don't want to force you out of a house you don't want to leave. I wouldn't feel happy with that. Okay, you keep the house, let's settle the bills. And eventually we did. And so I didn't buy a house. And that was a problem in a way, because when we came back we didn't have a place to live. Okay, so that was another problem. But I mean, these things are tests from Allah and trials from Allah, and maybe I made the wrong decision, but at least we could help other people and we didn't worry about these things. So I came to the conclusion that Allah didn't want me to buy a house, and that therefore He would look after me. So it was as simple as that, and that's what we did. And my wife, well, we thought we might go back to Pakistan to live, but then when she got these health problems, that was out of the question. We thought we might stay on in Saudi Arabia, but that turned out to be impossible as things happened. I'd put out feelers for Saudi nationality and found that I needed 4 ministers or 4 people at the minister level to sponsor me. And I'd got one, and I was looking for a second, and I possibly had 2 more. But before I get that far, the university informed me that the contract was not being renewed, and I had to leave the country. So that basically came to an end in 1997. So at that stage, I had to find my own way back. I was 59 years old, and it wasn't so easy to get back and try to start again in this country. But I think that's part for another. That's another part to talk about. Okay, and I think so. I think with that in mind, I'll stop here, and inshallah we'll continue in another part after a short break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another part of Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. I just mentioned that the contract was ended in Saudi Arabia, and now I had to come back to the UK, and this was a sad moment, I'm afraid, and it was a traumatic experience for my wife, because when we landed in London, and we tried to get off the plane. She actually couldn't walk off the plane. They had to get a wheelchair and wheel her off the plane and take her to a taxi. And we took the taxi to the station, and then we went up to Glasgow. Since we didn't have a place to stay, we stayed with a sister, and that meant it was a bit crowded. We stayed in Glasgow for a few months, and then eventually I managed to rent a place, and we settled down there. Couldn't get a job, although I was trying. I was writing almost 100 applications a day in various ways through agencies or whatever. Couldn't get an interview. The nephew had started a company. We'd helped put some money into it to get him started, and I actually attended that, but it wasn't making a profit, so he couldn't afford to pay me anything. And that was a web development company. So I was computing at least, and I got involved in that, and I was trying to contribute. And of course it took away some of the depression that I was feeling from coming back from Saudi. But I was still looking for a job, and eventually, I don't know how many months, maybe almost a year, I did get one interview in Carlisle in north of England, but the job didn't actually materialise because the company hadn't made the position, and the people that I was talking to were expecting them to, and they didn't, so that didn't materialise. I didn't get that job. I got another interview, and it was for a contractor, and I went along for that, and they told me it was for a junior position. I was too senior for that, even though the salary was £300 a day, but they told me that I was too senior for that. They couldn't offer me that job, so I didn't get that either. And then eventually I got an interview with the American Express Bank, and I got through the first interview. I didn't know there'd be a second, and I didn't think there'd be any follow-up, but they corresponded with me later on and said, we want you to come for a second interview. We've revised our requirement, and you can fit in this position, we think, ideally. So I went there, and I was offered that position, okay? And I would have been a consultant for 6 months, and if the problems had been resolved, then satisfactory in those 6 months, then I would be a permanent manager in the American Express Bank. But I wasn't happy working for a bank because of the interest aspect of it. And in the meantime, I was a trustee of a Daud organisation which is based in Saudi, and they had a meeting and they wanted to open an office in the UK. And when it came to it, I put my name forward, and I was optimistic of what I would call a realistic salary. But when it came to it, I got the position, but the salary wasn't as optimistic as I'd hoped for. But anyway, at least it was an alternative to the interest-based bank, so I accepted that. And so now we came down from Glasgow to Markfield near Leicestershire, and I opened an office for Dawa, an Islamic Information Office. And then it was a question of what to do from there. And initially I started off just putting the name in the yellow pages, and people phoned me up from time to time asking questions, and I gave them the best answers that I could. And then I wanted to do some talking, so I wrote to FOSIS, could I talk on their lecture circuit in the universities? And FOSIS is the Federation of Student Islamic Societies in universities in the UK. And they agreed, and I actually did do some talking in universities, but at the same time I didn't just want to do talking, I wanted to see what could be done. And what I did actually, I devised a Dawah course, and I actually used this in Loughborough University with the students in the Islamic Society there, and I held each week there was a module of the course, and maybe over 10 weeks I covered 10 modules, and by that time they were pretty experienced and I'd covered all the material I wanted, and I put this into a form of a little book and produced a little monograph on how to present Islam in the UK or in the West. And one of the FOSIS representatives came along, and he basically validated what I was doing, and he was happy with it, and so was I. And then it got proposed to the FOSIS president, and I put it on for his group, and he was happy with it too, and then it became part and parcel of what we were doing in the universities for the Islamic Awareness Weeks. And we went all around the country. I went from Southampton to London, to University of Surrey, to University of Essex, to Hull, to Newcastle, to Edinburgh, Dundee, Glasgow, and then back down to Lancaster, on the edge of the Lake District, and Birmingham, and Leicester, and Bristol, and even down to Swansea. So I got up and down the country quite regularly, in fact, and sometimes we were doing three places a week, you know, so it was quite a bit of travelling, and it was good fun. We enjoyed it. But I decided if I was going to do talking, I wanted to talk to the younger people, not to the older generation in this country, because the older generation are so stuck in what they think is Islam that it's not going anywhere. And what I wanted to do was to talk to the younger people. And if you get through to the younger people, they actually were talking to non-Muslims in the universities. So this would be a better idea for Dawah. That was my attitude. And my wife agreed with that, and she worked with me. And when we actually put on these Dawah courses, I would give maybe 3 20-minute modules of theory, and then we would have 3 workshops. And she would take the girls and I would take the boys. And that meant we could get through twice as many in the time. And the students loved it. It gave them the confidence they needed when they were in the exhibitions talking to people that would come along and asking questions on Islam. And this was the first sort of introduction to some of them and how to answer questions on Islam. And we got very good responses back from them, alhamdulillah. So much so that at one time, Leeds University, which is one of the biggest in the UK, they asked us to spend a week there, and that we would attend the exhibition for the whole day and answer questions for the difficult people, the difficult questions that the students didn't want to answer or couldn't answer or even debate. And we would do that, and then in the evenings they would chair the lectures, and in some case give a lecture or even just an ad hoc talk to the students that would be available. And for 5 years we did that, so alhamdulillah it was quite good. And did talk in some communities and put on Dawah courses in communities. In particular I spoke in the Regent's Park Mosque, which is the central mosque in London, and these seemed to go down quite well, alhamdulillah. Most of it was a PowerPoint presentation. I don't just talk with nothing behind me, and in actual fact it was quite good. And I actually spoke in Harrow to a group, and the chairman of that group, if you remember somewhere at the beginning I spoke about trying to read an ayah in Arabic in a study group in the University of Petroleum and Minerals, and the guy from Sri Lanka actually wasn't doing it, and then he did do it. I met him as the chairman of one of these groups in Harrow when I was on a panel there giving a lecture. So, you know, it's a small world. You meet people from all over and they keep coming back, you know, and you make contact again. And it's quite good because it's like a refresher course in some ways, because it brings back the memories and you remember what stage you were at then and what you were doing then and where you were and what you're doing now. Have you moved forward or have you moved backwards or whatever? Okay, so it's another way of reassessing yourself as well, alhamdulillah. So a lot of these things were taking place now, and it was actually good. And both my wife and I enjoyed these trips to the universities because the students are quite good, and they're intelligent to say the least, most of them anyway, alhamdulillah. And we'd have some good discussions too. And even after the lectures sometimes they would talk and say what they got out of it, or they would ask you about it, you know. I spoke in University College London, which is one of the big centres, and I spoke on, I think it's Is There a God? Okay, and I used all the arguments, including the Kalam argument, but I went all through the negating all the different wrong approaches first, and then I went through the right approach as it was, and then came to the conclusion. And afterwards, over dinner, one of the students said to me, he said, we wondered where you were going with all the information you were giving at the front, but when you got to the actual meat of your talk, we realised that you'd already answered all the questions we were going to ask, so we didn't have a question to ask on it. So alhamdulillah. And that actually went on the internet at one time, so some of my lectures have been on the internet. And that's another good feeling, because it's all very well talking to a small audience, but you really need a wider audience, especially if you're giving a long talk. And one of the ones in particular was I gave a lecture of about an hour and 20 minutes on misconceptions in Islam in Loughborough University. And actually there was a guy there from Australia, and he sat all the way through it, and he wasn't Muslim. And he was making notes at the same time, and I spoke to him afterwards, but he wouldn't give much away, but I assume he was from some interfaith group or whatever. Otherwise he wouldn't have been there. And I wanted to actually deal with a lot of the misconceptions which were in vogue at that time, and so I made sure I went through them all before I finished. And then they put all that up on the internet, so, you know, alhamdulillah. It wasn't a wasted effort in that sense, and I just hope that the material is worth it, you see. But it's interesting, and it's good to see that they do take these initiatives. And of course then there's it's there as a reference if people are interested, and alhamdulillah it will be used sometimes. So let me come to the end of this episode, and inshallah we'll meet again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.